In the year 174, on the frozen banks of the Danube, a man sat alone in his command tent. Outside, a war he did not want. Behind him, a plague that had already killed a quarter of his empire. In front of him, a blank notebook. He was the most powerful man alive, and he was writing himself a reminder, not a decree, not a speech, a private note meant for no one but himself, about controlling the mind rather than the world around it. His name was Marcus Aurelius. Those private notes would survive for nearly 2,000 years, under the title we now know as Meditations. 17 centuries later, in a bunker beneath London, another leader sat awake past midnight. The city above him was burning, bombs fell nightly, invasion felt to most of his country inevitable. Winston Churchill would later describe duty as something a man follows regardless of how he feels in the moment, a sentiment that could have been lifted straight from Marcus Aurelius' own notebook. Two empires, two men, separated by 1800 years. Both discovered the same truths under the same kind of pressure. Here are 4 of those truths, straight from Meditations, and how they played out an empire apart. Lesson 1. The dichotomy of control. Marcus Aurelius never wanted to be emperor, he wanted to be a philosopher, but history handed him Rome at its most overstretched. Plague, war on the frontier, a rival crowning himself emperor behind his back. And there was no time to retreat into a quiet life of study. So he brought the study to the battlefield. Each night, by lamplight, he wrote to himself. At the center of almost every entry sits one idea, the foundation of everything Stoic philosophy builds on afterward. Some things are within our control, our judgments, our choices, our effort, our character, and everything else is not. Suffering comes from confusing the two categories, trying to command what was never ours to command, while neglecting the one thing that always was. Marcus Aurelius ruled 60 million people and could not stop a plague, a flood, or a betrayal. He could only control how he met each one. There's a passage where he reminds himself before he even leaves his tent each morning to expect the people around him to be ungrateful and difficult that day, not out of bitterness, but so nothing catches him off guard. 18 centuries later, Churchill faced his own version of this. He could not control whether the Royal Air Force would hold, whether America would enter the war, or whether Britain's cities would still be standing by morning. What he could control was the tone he set and the discipline of continuing to function, regardless of how the war was going that week. And that is exactly where he chose to put his effort. The lesson: you do not choose your circumstances, you only choose your response, and that response is the only thing that was ever really yours. Lesson 2, Memento Mori. Remember you will die. Meditations returns again and again to mortality, not as something morbid, but as a tool for clarity. Marcus Aurelius reminds himself that his time is short, that emperors before him are already forgotten, and that the point of remembering death isn't fear, it's urgency. If your time is limited, wasting it on grudges, status, or other people's opinions is the real tragedy. Churchill lived this out under far more literal pressure. Every night of the Blitz carried a real chance he wouldn't see morning, and by most accounts, that awareness sharpened him rather than paralyzing him. He kept working, kept speaking, kept making decisions, precisely because he treated the time in front of him as too valuable to spend paralyzed by fear of the time running out. The lesson: the awareness that your time is limited isn't meant to frighten you into stillness, it's meant to focus you on what actually matters right now. Lesson 3. The obstacle is the way. One of the most quoted ideas from Meditations is Marcus Aurelius' observation that what stands in the way becomes the way, that an obstacle to action can itself be turned into fuel for action, that the mind adapts difficulty into opportunity. For Marcus, this wasn't theory. The plague, the war, the betrayal, all of it became the material he actually governed with. He didn't get the rain he wanted. He worked with the rain he had. For Churchill, the entire summer of 1940 was one continuous obstacle. No allies, a battered military, a country expecting invasion any day, and it became, retrospectively, the very thing that defined him, a prime minister remembered specifically because of how impossible that year was, not despite it. The lesson: the difficulty in front of you is rarely separate from the path forward. Often, it is the path. Lesson 4. Amor fati, the love of one's fate. Perhaps the hardest Stoic idea to actually live by, not just accepting what happens to you, but meeting it without wishing it were different. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself that everything happening to him was, in effect, exactly what he needed to be practicing virtue against. Not an obstacle to a good life, but the material a good life is built from. Churchill's wartime language reflects the same posture. He told the country plainly that he had nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. That is not denial. That is someone who accepted the full weight of a difficult reality and chose to act inside it anyway. rather than waiting for an easier one. The lesson: the goal isn't to get the circumstances you wanted, it's to meet the circumstances you actually have. What the fall of empires teaches about what lasts here is the part neither man could avoid, no matter how well he lived these lessons. Both of their empires eventually fell. Rome, which Marcus Aurelius spent his life defending, would fracture within a few centuries of his death. The British Empire, which Churchill fought to preserve, dissolved within a generation of his final term as Prime Minister. If the measure of these men's lives was, did the empire survive, they both failed. But Meditations itself predicts this ending. Marcus Aurelius wrote that in a little while he would be nobody and nowhere, and so would everything he could currently see, not as despair, but as a reminder not to build his sense of worth on something as fragile as an empire's permanence. That is the lesson most people skip past. Outcomes were never really theirs to keep. Character was. Marcus Aurelius is remembered not because Rome lasted, it didn't, but because of how he governed while he held the reins. Churchill is remembered not because the empire survived, it didn't, but because of how Britain conducted itself in its worst year. The empires crumbled, the four lessons did not. So here is what these two men, separated by nearly 2,000 years, actually leave you with. You will face things you cannot control. Your own version of a plague on the frontier or bombs falling on your city. You don't get to choose whether these things happen, but you get to choose the same four things Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself in his tent, and the same things Churchill practiced in his bunker. Control what's actually yours to control. Remember your time is short and act like it. Treat the obstacle as the way forward, not the thing blocking it. And meet what actually happens to you instead of waiting for something easier. Empires rise and empires fall. That was true in the 2nd century, and it was true in the 20th. It will be true of whatever you're building now, too. Build it anyway, not because it will last forever, nothing does, but because how you build it is the only part of the story that was ever really yours. If this gave you something to think about, stay a while. There's a lot more where this came from.